Welcome to Neural News. Today we're talking with Dr. James C. Zimring about his latest book, Partial Truths: How Fractions Distort Our Thinking, published by Columbia University Press. Dr. Zimring is a professor of experimental pathology at the University of Virginia, where he conducts translational and basic research on blood transfusion, immunology, metabolism, and microbiology. He has an MD and a Ph.D. in immunology from Emory University School of Medicine and has published over 120 research studies. So it's an honor to speak to you today, Dr. Zimring.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
Thank you. So could you give a brief overview of your new book, Partial Truths, and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, so I study the science you referred to, but I also teach critical thinking classwork to the graduate population here. And I am deeply invested in the metacognition and thinking about thinking. And so in my previous book, I called What Science Is and How It Really Works, I was trying to capture the gestalt of science and communicate it to both a lay audience and also to graduate students and maybe professional scientists as well. And then out from that, kind of a theme emerged that you can explain a lot of human cognitive processes by using fractions as sort of a metaphor to understand them, a lens through which to work. It's important to say that I am not making the claim, I never would, that human brains work like little calculators, that we have little like mathematics circuitry and there's fractions running around our heads. That's not what this new book is about, but it's trying to use fractions as an instrument to understand human cognitive processes.
What could the possible evolutionary values of logical reasoning be for the survival of the human species as a whole, when the majority of organisms on Earth lack this ability, yet are able to thrive in their respective environments?
Well, I mean, that's it's a complicated question. How long an answer do you want? I mean, yes, there's a great diversity of life on Earth, each form in its own niche and with very special adaptations. I think it's hard to argue against the observation that humans, for now at least, seem to have kind of won the game. You might say, I mean, we don't know what the outcome is here. It may be, from an evolutionary standpoint, that making monkeys smart is a really bad idea, that they just go on and destroy themselves. But I think, at least for now, we have the capacity to control natural phenomenon to some extent, and to use that to our advantage. And fundamentally, reasoning, maybe not formal logic, because that's a different thing, but reasoning is something that humans appear to be able to do to a much greater extent than other species. But this does not mean, of course, that other species don't reason. Depending on how you use the term, certainly other species think and remember and navigate the world. We just seem to have taken that to a higher level. So I think the evolutionary advantages there are kind of obvious, but like all things in evolution, it's a double-edged sword. The fact that it's a net positive doesn't mean it doesn't also come with negatives, which we have to live with.
Yeah. And so why do humans favor anecdotal information to population-based or more fact-based data?
So yeah, you're asking me a why question. First, let me just answer the question I can answer, is that we do. That even trained professionals who are formally trained in data analysis respond more to anecdotal evidence, to stories from other people, and this is a demonstrable psychological phenomenon. You're asking the question why. There I have to speculate, because I wasn't around millions of years ago, that through the vast majority of our evolution, we have been small nomadic groups who use language and communication as an instrument of social organization to give an advantage in our environment. We did not evolve in the context of large statistical data. We did not evolve in the context of Gaussian distributions and p-values and these things. We evolved because a friend of ours went over the hill and saw a big bison and came back and said, oh, there's a bison over there. And so we respond to that kind of information very well and change our behavior based upon it. Now, you can learn about population-based data, and you can certainly be trained to understand the value of it. But I would submit to you that even the best of scientists, right, when they go to a seminar series or they go to an international meeting and everybody's presenting data, they are swayed by the presentation style. They respond to someone who's telling them a scientific story, even the trained professional. So we probably have this trait because for almost all the time we've been evolving, that's what we were, surrounded with. Modern society, best we can tell, we stopped wandering around most of us stopped wandering around 10,000 years ago, right? And it's probably created civilization with lasting records 2,400 years ago. That is a femtosecond. That is the smallest possible sliver of time in the history of the human species. So that's, I think, how I would answer your question. It's a good question.
Yeah. And do you think this causes any sort of bias within the population?
So respectfully, all thinking has bias. You can try and change what you're biased towards, but unless you have the ability to swallow the world whole and consider everything, which no human does, you're going to have some bias. The answer to your question is, of course, this creates bias, but then what kind of bias? And is it good or bad? And how do we handle it? And so, it's not a problem to be swayed by anecdotal evidence and storytelling when anecdotal evidence is correct. It's actually a very good thing.
Yeah.
Also, there's a huge advantage to it from the standpoint of time and mental processing capacity, right? So if a friend of yours said, hey, this is a great place, you should go to dinner, and you couldn't take that as evidence. You would never go to dinner just because someone said that. Actually, you had to get on the internet. You had to find 18 different reviews. You had to take the reviewers' comments in the context of their average reviews of restaurants because you're going to want to weigh them appropriately. And then you would apply some calculating algorithm lined up with your own tastes and how you've experienced these reviews in the past to see, should I go to dinner there? You'd be paralyzed, right? I mean, you'd never actually get out the door of your house. But the problem is that oftentimes individual observations do not reflect a greater population. And there are reasons for this. Sometimes the person observing only has access to a small part of the world, but also our minds filter what we experience fundamentally. Our sensorium filter the world. We only perceive some of which we sense. We only notice some of which we perceive. We only remember some of which we notice. And then when confirmation bias attaches, our current belief construct changes how we see the world, not how the world is, we change it, right? And so anytime someone comes to you and tells you something, what they are telling you has been filtered through all of that mess. So, of course, this introduces bias because you are taking a small little snapshot of the world and weighing that very heavily compared to what the world really is.
Yeah. And so in the book, you mention mental shortcuts or heuristics, a natural method of reasoning humans involuntarily take part in during logical judgment or thought. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this method of reasoning?
Well, first of all, it's the only thing we can do really, fundamentally. The advantages to heuristics. So heuristics are mental shortcuts, a rule of thumb thinking, where oftentimes we're given complex problems and we don't solve the problem we're given. We solve a simpler problem, and that answer intuitively makes sense to us. And we don't, this is not something that you are aware of. You see something and the answer pops into your head, right? So the reason we do this is because it allows us to react quickly to a complicated environment with not too much mental resources devoted. And most of the time, or at least much of the time, it works. If the heuristics didn't work, if they didn't give us an advantage, we wouldn't have evolved that process. But remember, we didn't evolve to learn correct factual information.
Yeah.
We didn't evolve to get the world right. We evolved to do whatever gave us an advantage in having more offspring.
Yeah.
Who themselves survive to reproductive age.
Yeah.
And if the environment is such that getting things wrong happens to give you an advantage to make more babies, that's what we'll do, right? The theory of evolution, which is a lovely and complex theory, at least part of it can simply be boiled down to the following. Whatever makes more of itself, there will be more of. That's it, right? That's the whole thing. But then it does represent very serious problems, because what is good in some circumstances or many circumstances is injurious in other areas. And what cognitive psychology of the past 5 or 6 decades has allowed us to do, it's cracked open a nut where we can actually look at how our reasoning leads us astray, and maybe what we can do to mitigate it. So I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but such tremendous respect for them, because think about the task they had. They have to figure out the defects of the human mind using the human mind, right? And so, heuristics, we don't know about them, and there's always this question, well, how many heuristics are there out there that we're unaware of, that we haven't discovered yet? The answer is I don't know, because so we can go into specific examples if that's helpful. But this is basically human thinking, and I would submit to you that part of scientific training is learning to unlearn millions of years of evolution when you need to do it. Learning how to, you can't really turn off the human brain, but learning how to recognize when you're thinking a certain way, and how to bring methodologies to bear to control errors and confounders to the best of our ability. You'll never eliminate them, but we're doing pretty well compared to historically. If you look at scientific methodologies over time, right, we are constantly adding new methodological instruments to try and mitigate error as we learn more types of errors, right? So if you go back just a couple hundred years and you read a paper by Joseph Priestley, right, who discovered oxygen along with Lavoisier. He didn't know he discovered oxygen. He actually thought he discovered dephlogisticated air, but that's a story for a different day. And you read the paper, he has 2 mice in a jar, and they can breathe a really long time, and another mouse can't. If you said to him, wow, well, how many times did you repeat the experiment? What kind of a statistical test did you add? What are your odds of a type 1 error, and what's the p-value? That phrase would have zero meaning to him. He would have no understanding whatsoever what you were talking about. In fact, he would think you were kind of a magical idiot, and you would say to him, actually, you may be falling prey to type 1 errors. And because so as we have begun to understand chance effects, we have implemented those methodologies, and that's the history of science, right? So I think that a large part of science is learning to control, mitigate the natural tendencies of errors that we have, but still hold on to the advantages of those thought processes.
Yeah. And so could you provide some more examples of these mental shortcuts or heuristics?
Well, yeah, sure. So perhaps most relevant to this type of conversation, there's a lot of little word games that people can give you. I always want to make sure I get the words just right, so I have the note here. But I mean, a classic example would be, it takes 5 minutes for 5 machines to make 5 widgets. So how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? What do you think?
100 minutes.
Yeah, so that's almost what everyone says, and that sounds right. Intuitively, that seems right. That's a human brain doing your shortcut, but that's wrong.
Yeah.
Each machine makes 1 widget every 5 minutes, right? It takes 5 minutes for 5 machines to make 5 widgets, which means that each machine makes 1 widget every 5 minutes. So 100 machines can make 100 widgets in 5 minutes. All right, so these are the types of phenomenon that cognitive psychologists have discovered in the laboratory, and they've said, wow, when given problems like this, humans always tend to make, well, not always, it's a population distribution, but the majority of humans tend to make these types of errors, and why? But I want to focus on some particular heuristics here. Probably the strongest of which is the availability heuristic. And this manifests itself in science and outside of science, and is a reason for a lot of the conflict between those 2 worlds. So the availability heuristic, in short, is when a human cognition, a person, replaces an actual probability with the likelihood that something comes to their mind. Or to say that in an inverse way, the more likely something is to come to your mind, the more likely you think it is to actually occur. Okay. And so a great example, these are not examples I came up with, they're classic examples, is driving or flying for traveling, right? So a lot of people are afraid to fly and they choose to drive instead. In fact, in the book, I go on about my family. My father had a very bad experience in an airplane when he was younger. They almost crashed. He just didn't want to fly anymore, which is understandable. And we drove because we didn't want to die while traveling to Florida for our vacation each year. And, when an airplane crashes, which they do from time to time, it makes the news. There's investigations that go on, at least in the States, the FAA comes on board and there's all this kind of commotion around it. They interview the families of the people who have died, and it's a big splash. And Hollywood makes movies about this, 20,000 feet in the sky, this big plane, all these kinds of things. And it's present in our minds. Very, very few people ever die in plane crashes. The risk is vanishingly small. In the States, at least, right? More than 30,000 people die in car crashes every year. But unless it was a celebrity or something really weird, massive car pileup, we never hear about it, right? It's not present to us. Hollywood doesn't make movies called Fender Bender, and everyone's like, oh my God, there's going to be a car crash. So the lifetime risk of dying in a car crash in the States is 1 in 100. That's insanely high compared to flying. Now you have to do the statistics very carefully because some people fly very seldom or maybe never at all. And most people drive, not everyone, but most people. And so you want to make sure this is, you're not falling prey to a confounder that the death rate of driving is higher simply because more people drive. But once you control for miles traveled and take all these things into account, it is so much safer to fly than drive. But my family chose to drive because when we thought about how you might die in a trip, we thought about airplanes because it was available to us, because we saw it all over the place, right? And so we made a really dumb choice. That was a dumb choice. We increased the likelihood we were going to die. Same thing with swimming in the ocean, right? So
you mentioned the same thing about sharks in your book.
So sharks, right? So there's movies, Jaws 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes on forever. And when someone gets eaten by a shark, it's all over the news. Oh my gosh! But you're much more likely to drown in the ocean. Your odds of drowning in the ocean are really high. But you don't see a movie coming out of Hollywood called Riptide, right? And like it's just like a couple different scenes of people drowning, and that's the movie. You don't see that. So the availability heuristic is we do this, and it actually causes a lot of problems because people think that And by the way, we can go into more examples, real examples in our politics, in scientific misunderstanding about things, in vaccine denialism, et cetera, if you want. But I would submit to you that the availability heuristic is ever present in these types of dialogues. That's one of the heuristics. The other big player here, and you may or may not call this formally a heuristic, is confirmation bias. And this is probably the biggest divisive bias that human minds have. What confirmation bias is that the moment you have a belief, any belief, you start filtering your experience based upon that belief, so that it's not that seeing is believing, it's that believing is seeing. And so there are these lovely cognitive psychology studies that have been done where they took two groups that they had previously given surveys to, so they knew that they had different views on a political topic. In this case, it was whether or not the death penalty is a deterrent, is the one I described. And then they gave academic studies to them, right, to each of them, and let them each read the academic studies, and then talk about how their beliefs might have been affected by the data that they saw. And they gave the same academic studies to both groups, and each group increased the strength of the belief that they initially held based upon the same information. And so you look at the world today, and you can see this happening real time. Now, it's not just, people believe stuff more strongly, but when they dug down into why, it's that the people looked at the data that supported their belief and ranked it as higher quality data. the methods were better, they didn't have confounders, they controlled for this and that. And the data that was against their belief, they looked and said, well, that is worse data. This is not, by the way, because the studies were intrinsically different in quality, because they did the experiment where they switched which study had what effect, and they controlled for, they did a multivariate analysis. Basically, they controlled for a lot of other confounders, and they couldn't find anything that could explain it other than confirmation bias. But if there's probably more evidence for confirmation bias than there is for any cognitive error out there. And it's a real problem, and for scientists too, right? I don't know, anyone who spent a lot of time in science, they realize scientists fall in love with their theories. They fall in love with their theories, and they will twist information. One of my favorite stories is Linus Pauling, right, who has won 2 more Nobel Prizes than I've won. And near the end of his life, or in the latter decades of his life, he became convinced that vitamin C in massive doses was a good thing for the human body to take. And initially, there was actually reasonable theory and data to suggest that. But as more and more and more data came out showing that if anything, it was the opposite, he just went way overboard in not rejecting his hypothesis. So obviously, this is a super smart guy, right? And in fact, the history of science, I think that history of science has taught us a lot. There were very, very good reasons for Galileo himself not to accept Copernicus's model of the solar system. And when he was presented with those arguments, which he could not refute, he basically said, well, whatever, I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to believe this. And when Darwin first wrote Origin Species, right, and also Alfred Wallace had the idea at the same time, there was a whole chapter devoted to problems with the theory, and a number of academics put forward problems that even Darwin hadn't thought of, because the concept of heredity at the time that Darwin wrote would make evolution by natural selection impossible. The way that they thought genes were inherited, and he was very happy to dismiss that. I mean, this is what I believe. So confirmation bias is everywhere, and the fact that people are unaware of it is fundamentally problematic. So in the United States of America, at least, one of our biggest adjudicating bodies is the Supreme Court. We have 9 justices. And assuming that they're good people, meaning that they're not, taking bribes to do things, they don't have some crazy agenda, manipulative agenda. Here are 9 incredibly smart people, right? 9 scholars of the highest order who are all looking at the same world, who are hearing the same arguments, who are reading the same briefs, and they come to wildly different opinions, but they're all rational. Because I would submit to you, each of them is experiencing a different world. That's what they're experiencing. They have the same world in front of them because they're filtering the information through their belief constructs, and it makes sense to them. So these are the types of heuristics that I'm talking about in the book. And you might say, well, that's interesting, but why? What do fractions have to do with that? I mean, and so again, remember, fractions are just an analogy. But if you think about probability as, a fraction is just a mathematical symbol that represents that if you have a population of things, how many of those things have a particular property? And that goes on the numerator, the whole population goes on the denominator. So in the availability heuristic, you are just noticing very small amount of the world that happens to be in your mind because you encountered it, you heard it, or you remembered it, over the denominator of everything that's out there. And you're basically ignoring the denominator. You're basically saying this is the thing. And with confirmation bias, if you're going to make an argument that it's rational to believe things that are probably true, so I should believe things that have the most evidence that support them. The fraction of evidence that supports something is the amount of evidence that supports it over all the evidence, right? And so if you're distorting that because your evidence that supports it, you're forcing the numerator when it doesn't really belong there, and evidence that goes against it, you're excluding from the fraction altogether. You're perverting the process through changing numerator and denominator. So that's the analogy. But these are the types of heuristics I'm talking about. And by the way, there are many more. They're very important, and they manifest in all walks of life, not just science, but politics, economics, frankly, how other people can exploit you, because whether consciously or not, human heuristics are not just the way we think, but they are a door into manipulating us. And so this is also part of the story, and which is also really quite important.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Zimring. And a link to purchase Dr. Zimring's new book, Partial Truths, is available in the description.
Thanks for having me.